everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Freightonomics. I am head of Freight Market Intelligence, Zach Strickland, here with Chief Economist Anthony Smith, and this is the show where we discuss the overall macroeconomic environment and combine it with the logistics sector. So we've got Dr. Zach Rogers on today to give us their LMI update and talk about a few other things. We've had a pretty interesting little set here since we last talked to Dr. Z, so I really want to I want to talk about the LMI, obviously, but I also want to talk about some of these kind of ongoing environmental issues, not the environment in terms of global warming or not, whatever that is, but the environment that we're dealing with macroeconomically as well as in the transportation space. So that being said, Anthony Smith, are you going to be rude today and look down at your computer and not talk to us?
You bet I am. I'm going to be looking down. So if you want to jump in on the conversation, because we're going to be talking about a lot of good stuff. AB5 is going to be up for topic, as well as other policy changes and things like that. Want to jump into the conversation, you have questions for myself or Zach, you want to get Zach canceled, anything like that, jump in. If you happen to be watching 12 Eastern Standard Time on this Thursday afternoon, you can voice your opinion, ask a question, give some insight, join in, just have a shout out. So I'll be on LinkedIn watching for those comments.
Yeah, and today is probably the day that you're going to cancel me because I am going to kind of break my own rule and get a little political. Not that I'm going to be political myself, but I'm going to talk about a little bit of how some of the politics of the world, geopolitical politics, they are a part of the supply chain environment. So we have to acknowledge their existence. And there's some questions out there right now, especially regarding our relationship with China, our current economic viability in regards to China. And of course, I'm not even going to touch on Russia at this point, but it's something that you have to, it has become such a big factor and a political risk in your day-to-day business nowadays. And it's something that we have to kind of, breach, even though I don't really want to.
I mean, and starting it off, I mean, of course, we have some news items that we have to jump into. And Zach, you put together a lot of great articles to kind of jump into. The first one, of course, being international, jumping into what's happening in China and the slowing down and their investment strategy right now. So that's going to be a definitely interesting one, because China's always doing something a little bit interesting, whether it's the complete shutdown and the zero COVID policy, or just completely shifting, their investment strategies. Is always something coming out of China.
Well, yeah, and this one is in regards to American investment in China. So a lot of the investment kind of soured from the American standpoint in March. Basically, the U.S., this is an investment in the ETFs, Chinese ETFs. So a compilation of all the Chinese funds, or stocks, I should say, into these funds. And now our financial sector is to 180 and said, okay, we're good now. And this comes on the heels of basically Vice Premier Liu He, the economic czar over there, basically came out and said that he made some market-friendly speech that says, hey, guys, we're going to be cool now all of a sudden that's all our financial sector needed was some sort of speech. And I doubt that that's fully the reasoning behind it, but because the last time I checked, it's hard to kind of trust anything from that economy over there, right, Anthony?
That's 100% correct. I mean, if you look at anything that's coming out, you have to take it with a bucket of salt, where it's their reporting numbers of their industrial production activity, their GDP growth, anything like that. It has to be taken into consideration, like, okay, what's really happening? What can you kind of read between the lines to get into the details of what's really going on there? So there's always just going to be this mask, this veil in the sense of what's actually happening versus what is happening. I mean, back into, the ghost cities that were being built, you had to look at, what kind of activity was happening on the rails to really kind of dive into, okay, there's industrial activity, but where's it going? What does it really mean for the actual growth? And now when you look at this type of investment strategy, whether it's coming from here or to China, it's also going to kind of be mirrored with, okay, what are they kind of looking to get at? Not what their actions are, but what are going to be some of the outcomes from their actions and what's going to be the direction they're trying to head in.
Yeah, and it, to me, and again, this came from the Wall Street Journal, and one of the things that I also read about this week was the fact, I mean, combining this with this idea that our current political structure / environment, of course, bleeding into the economic world as it happens, is it's so polarized right now with the conservative and Democrat really just lining up. There's no middle ground in our political system at this point. Bipartisan stuff is really not happening. And that's been one of the criticisms. The premier of Singapore came out and said, this is not a great structure for such a rapidly changing environment. And I think we can kind of agree on that. Our structure isn't great if we're going to be so polarized and say you can either be totally right or totally left. You're not going to come to a lot of decisions, and those decisions are going to be extreme at that. So I see what they're saying here, and then maybe this is what the financial sector is sort of looking at in the way that our own economic stability or political stability is transitioning down into the economy a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of those things that's almost like a seesaw effect of overcorrection into one way and overcorrection into another way. And even what there's in biomechanics, I know this is an econ show and a freight show, but biomechanics, even when you're running, if you're swaying too far left and too far right, you're never going to be efficient in getting across that finish line in the fastest way possible.
Yes, and I want to talk to Dr. Rogers about that here in a bit. But first off, let's tackle a few of these stories real quickly here. So big news this week, and I wanted to this one, Vermont-based LTL carrier Land Air reportedly ceases operations. Now, you're going to think, okay, the market's turning, another trucking failure. Nah. Go ahead and check this out. Clarissa Hawes wrote this report on freightwaves.com. But to me, the big takeaway, anytime a private equity company takes some sort of financial control of a trucking company, it is not a great mix. My personal opinion, having had the experience in that sector, and that it's not a good fit for what they expect as an outcome in terms of transactional revenue. Because that's what they make their money on, is the transactions. They don't make money on the business itself. They want to turn that into some sort of multiple of earnings sale in 2 to 5 years. Now, if you think about that, when you're talking about such tight operations, they don't have a lot of free cash flow in some of these trucking operations. So they don't get a very high valuation. So that means they're going to have to figure out a way to either reduce cost or expand their margins, which expanding your margin is heavily dependent on the market.
Yeah.
So, and also you don't want to have a trucking company with a short-term horizon on your revenue growth, because all that does is kill the company in the long run.
Right.
And so this to me is just an example of private equity and trucking just do not go together very well.
Yeah, and I've had experience working in an environment with private equity, and you're exactly right. That timeline that they're trying to hit, that 3 to 5 year window of like, all right, we have to get this right, turn it, and flip it for a profit, and just keep it moving. And when you're looking at what they're looking to do, it's just, okay, like you said, fix these levers. What's the easiest way to go about expanding our profit margin? Okay, like you said, market dependent. What's the easiest way to free up some cash? And that's going to be one of those areas.
Exactly. So I want to go ahead and bring Dr. Rogers on because I know he's got lots of things to say about this. And I just felt like that was a good one to tackle there, because we also, of course, had our LMI released. Todd Maiden covered this on freightwaves.com, our financial market guy. But welcome, Dr. Rogers. Thanks for coming back out.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me. Now, I don't think you should ask me questions about how to run and stay balanced left and right. That was not, no one has ever thought of me as a running expert. You can do the 23andMe tests, and they'll give you little attributes about yourself. And the other Dr. Rogers, who was here last time, one of the attributes it said on his was not a sprinter, which is correct. There's no running in the Rogers family. But I'm happy to talk about some of the other stuff. And if you want, we can start right into the LMI.
Let's do it. So what do we see this month? I mean, we were talking about last month, we're still seeing a continuation of trend. Inventory growth still a thing, but a slowing pace. Transportation capacity becoming a little bit more, not as active as it's been. So what did we see in June?
Well, some of those things flipped around, actually. So inventory levels going back up. We're now at a 71. For everyone who's not familiar, any number over 50 means growth. Any number under 50 means contraction. That means for inventory levels, we have been in the 70s now for 5 of the 6 months of 2022. Now, to put that into perspective, from 2016 to 2021, we were only above 70 twice. Okay. And we've already been above it 5 times out of 6. And so inventory levels continue to climb, especially as we see a slowdown in consumer spending. You know, consumer spending was a little bit inflated in May at least by sort of long-term goods, you know, durables, little consumable things, consumer packaged stuff. That really dipped. You know, it still grew, but like 0.2%, I think, from April. So we have a lot of softness, especially at the retail level. And if you break out, you know, warehousing utilization upstream and downstream, those downstream retailers just have significantly more warehousing utilization right now because everything's sort of stuck down at the end of supply chains. What this means, going back to your other question, Zach, is warehousing capacity. We thought maybe we were seeing like a little light at the end of the tunnel last month, because last month in May, the second half, we saw warehousing capacity get up to 50.5, the first growth we had seen in 2 years, since September 2020, I believe, the first growth we had seen. Wiped out. Now we're at a 41 in June. That's gone. That was a mirage. There was nothing there. And we're seeing that both upstream and downstream. Warehousing capacity continues to be incredibly tight. And as I'm sure we'll talk about as we go on, that's causing ripple effects all the way up the chain, where we're seeing dwell times go up, even though there's not a lot of ships off the docks, and just problems all throughout the chain. And this is before peak season. And so it'll be interesting kind of to see where this goes in the next couple months.
Yeah. So I got to ask, do you think this is more of a factor of over ordering, or is this some of the waning demand? Because the retail sales numbers, they're not down dramatically. And I know there's some inflationary pressure there, but I haven't seen anything that makes me think that the orders for, durable goods have shrunk enough to kind of account for all of this. So do you think that this is more of a demand side or a over ordering situation for the warehouses?
A lot of it has to do with the over ordering, because for a long time retail demand was going like this. And so we were ordering for this trajectory, and then instead it's maybe here. So like you say, it's still some growth, but not the real level of sharp growth that we were hoping for. And a lot of that has to do with last year, lead times effectively tripled. And so it was almost impossible to make sure that you had inventory when customers need it. And this is a classic sort of overcorrection that we see all the time. And it was really an overcorrection to the overcorrection. 2020, we had too much inventory. And so we just stopped ordering things. Remember, car companies were like, oh, well, we shouldn't build any cars right now. That'll be smart. That'll be good for us long term. GM won't miss 95,000 cars in the early 2022. And they stopped ordering. And then 2021 happens. Demand goes through the roof. And because we'd overcorrected in 2020, we didn't have nearly enough inventory. We overcorrect again, and this goes back to Anthony's thing of running. You notice I'm doing it more like a car, because that's how I go down the street to get the mail in my car. And so, we overcorrect the other direction, and now we have too much inventory. And the problem with the too much inventory is it came in so late, and there was nothing really to do with it. And now we are going to see, I think, something fascinating in the next couple months, because as both of you know, and there's been a lot of articles about some freight waves, this is sort of the slow season in terms of ports, what we kind of have just been through. In July, August, September, we should see, generally in a normal year, imports really starting to ramp up. Right now, who knows what's going on in China, but we should see imports starting to ramp up, back to school, Q4, holidays, all of that stuff. It is so important this year for companies not to overcorrect again. But at the same time, you don't want to make the same mistakes you made in 2020, where you totally take your foot off the gas with orders, because then we overcorrect going the other way. And so I think it's going to be fascinating over the next couple months to see how companies try to sort of thread that needle.
Oh, we lost him for a minute. Like to see him frozen up there, but I think he's making a good point here. The fact that we get stuck in this cycle of correction and overcorrection, like. We can't seem to find that middle ground. And, I was at Gartner a few weeks ago in Orlando and talking to a lot of these supply chain managers, And the biggest problem they complained about was demand forecasting. And it's so hard to do right now, right?
It is, and I think so. When we're looking at the misplaced inventory and where everything is, because we have too much of some of the wrong stuff.
Yeah.
The thought process, I think, for a lot of producers and a lot of shippers is, okay, we were talking about this earlier on in the year, beginning of the year, fire sales, just get rid of everything, empty out the inventories, make room for this new stuff that has to come in. The issue might be that some retailers, some outlets get rid of everything and the replenishment is going to be so pricey, and that's going to create another type of inflationary period, because we look at what some of the deflationary levers might be, because one of the questions I got to ask when I made the call of, hey, there might be an oversupply of inventory kind of moving forward into the middle part of the year, is like, hey, won't that have some deflationary impacts on it? And the answer is yes, in some markets, in some areas, but it's going to be inflationary when some of these producers look to replenish their supply, replenish that inventory. And that's not going to mean that there's going to be fixes or changes in the supply chain as those replenishments come back in. So there might be a short-term relief to some inflationary pressures in some small segments, but then it's just going to be amplified even more so as that replenishment kind of comes back into play.
And again, the pendulum swing.
Yeah.
That's really the environment we're talking about, and it's made things really volatile. So the problem with volatility, now some people like myself kind of like chaos, but I like controlled chaos. I don't like things to go outside of certain boundaries. I think some level of chaos is beneficial for progress and making things better. We get stuck in a rut too long, things stagnate.
Yeah.
It's not that interesting. But a little bit of volatility is good. I think what we have right now, though, is things swinging outside of those boundaries a lot, and it's making it so when you have this level of volatility, and this is, again, it goes back to that political concern that we started the show with about how we're so bipolar in our decision-making process now. This is really hard to forecast for. Typically, you have these kind of somewhat predictable patterns we call them seasonality. I hate seasonally adjusted figures because you're always relying on that pattern to persist throughout time. And it's not like the weather, Yes, the weather does have an influence, but that's the only thing that you can kind of say seasonally is going to occur every year. But even then we have variation, with that. So when you have this level of volatility, it forces people to become more flexible, which isn't the worst thing, but you have to hedge all these decisions now. And so when you hedge all these decisions, you lose your ability to progress quicker.
Right.
You lose your precision. You lose your specialization. And if you're not able to kind of focus your energy, you're not going to be able to move forward as quickly.
And I think that's going to be another area an area that you kind of touched on just now was that ability to really kind of pivot and move and make these changes. And that kind of leaks into a concern I have around the U.S. economy, and that's going to be around the consumer. We're seeing, of course, savings rates drop, things like that. I keep saying, and I know we have in the notes here, consumer sentiment, I think, was mentioned here.
Came out. They don't feel good.
They haven't felt good. And this is one of those areas that I've kind of been not ignoring, but putting on the back burner for a while. Yeah. And only because it doesn't matter right now, because it's being blunted and kind of shielded off by the jobs market.
Yeah.
And that jobs market is a temporary, weak and fragile shield, because that can be gone in a blink of an eye. It can just completely drop overnight if there's all these, layoffs, recessionary trends set in. Now companies are starting to, let go of a lot of people. Business conditions just completely shift. Now these consumers are going to be faced with the reality of the decisions that they put themselves in over the last year and a half or so. Now, all that purchasing activity, that buying, that the credit card, those non-revolving credit utilization, whether it be a home or car. I think the automotive market is going to be one to watch closely, because that likely be one of the first ones to go before they decide not to pay their mortgages. And so that's going to be one I'm watching closely. But these consumers are going to be exposed in a really awful way if there's job
real
markets.
Way. It's not going to be just like, I feel bad about the future. It's going to be like, I look at my bank account, I don't got it.
Yeah, because before there's like, hey, at least I can just go get a different job or higher paying job. When that's no longer the case, now these credit card utilizations that's been, kind of piling up over the last year and a half, 2 years, is going to be a reality.
Mm-hmm.
The other nightmare that's really building up, I think, for the end of the year is going to be those buy now, pay later programs that a lot of people have been utilizing. There are going to be some penalties, I think, for, hey, I missed a payment. Okay, now that's going to start incurring some interest rate in charges. And that's going to be another pain point for a lot of consumers, not just a credit card, not just the card payments, but also some of those buy now, pay laters that have been really piling up over this last year and a half.
Yeah, because now obviously the credit card, the revolving credit's not going to be that buffer.
Yeah,
it's already kind of spent.
Right.
So the one thing, and I guess we're probably not going to have Dr. Z on. We're going to have him next week though, because we're not done with him if his schedule permits. I wanted to touch on the AB5 situation. So maybe we got him back. So maybe we can bring him back, because I kind of wanted to at least ask him his thoughts on this. I know, Dr. Rogers, thank God you're back. I wanted to. I don't know if you caught any of our conversation or discussion, but I kind of fast forwarded through some things. And of course, I want to have you back next week if you can to complete our discussion. But I at least wanted to get your thoughts. And I know this is sort of outside your, focus area, but I want to get your thoughts on AB5. And I don't know if you've been following it closely or not. So, it's, it has a lot of, obviously interest in it, because everybody thinks that it's going to be this big thing that disrupts capacity further. Well, it's happening as we're transitioning to a, obviously a looser environment. Do you have any specific takeaways from this specific ruling?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. By the way, I think this is the first time it was ever not my Wi-Fi's fault. So I just want us to mark down the day and time. So AB5 is really interesting because it's coming at a time when I think we were seeing some market forces moving against owner-operators anyway. You guys had a great article last week talking about the spread between diesel wholesale and retail prices. And as we know, the smaller sort of owner-operators, the ones who are kind of most in the crosshairs of AB5, they're paying retail price for diesel anyway, right? And so they were already at a big disadvantage. And we had seen, and we're seeing this in the warehouse space too, which I think is fascinating, we are seeing a big sort of absorption of some of the smaller players by the some of the bigger players. And we're seeing that in transportation, and we're seeing that in warehousing. And what I think AB5 is really going to do is sort of speed that up a little bit and move us towards a place where we do have more sort of truckers who are working for companies as official employees. Now, there's a weird push and pull here, because on one hand, you're like, look, a lot of the appeal of the trucking sort of lifestyle is being an owner operator, being your own boss. And really, we kind of have this system that exists because they're not full employees. If they become full employees, costs are going to go way, way up. All right, right. We all know sort of what sort of pre-deregulation trucking was like, where a frozen turkey was twice as expensive as a cooked turkey, depending on whatever crazy regulations we have. And I don't think we want to go back towards what we had in the 60s and the 70s. At the same time, during that period, the adjusted wages for truckers was much higher, and it was a much more attractive job. It was a true middle-class job, something that had to do with unions and things like that. And so, yes, we will, I think, absolutely add expenses with AB5. And for some truckers, they might not like it. But for others, it may make trucking a more attractive job. And, we've been butting our heads for the last 20 years about how do we get more people to sign up to be truckers. And possibly with the regulations in AB5, there will be some positives on that side. But, I think there's bad and good. It's certainly not a panacea. I would have been fine if they just used it for Uber and left the trucks alone, basically. But we'll see how it turns out.
Do you think it's a net negative or net benefit if you are a shipper?
If you're a shipper, I think there's the adjustment period will be negative. Okay. I think there will be a negative in the adjustment period. But if it, say, increases capacity eventually down the line, once we've adjusted to the new normal, it could be better, but that's more of a long-term thing. And then, of course, always putting more money in the pockets of consumers, I think, is a good idea, because that's where the spending happens. You put money in the pockets of really rich people, and they start a Bitcoin that goes nowhere. So I think you want to put it in the pockets of, truckers and things like that. I think long-term, it may be a net positive, but certainly the short-term is going to be a tough adjustment period, I think.
Oh, that's a fascinating take. I hadn't even thought about the fact that you're talking about the acceleration of the defragmentation of that, which is part of that cycle that we're seeing right now, which actually counteracts the inflationary pressure a little bit, which is, I hadn't thought about that.
A lot of levers being pulled here.
I mean, woo, that's why we have you on. Well, we're out of time for this week's show. Hopefully we can make up for it next week. I know it's still summer, so you come back.
Yep. No, I'll be around. I'm drinking water like Anthony wants me to. And I would also just point out, bipartisanship does exist. We did pass the no daylight savings time bill 100-0 in April.
We did.
Okay?
You're right.
All
And I love that.
like the sun to stay out longer.
Some things we can all agree on still. Thank goodness. You've given me hope, Dr. Rogers. Well, thank you for joining us this week. And of course, thank you all for watching. We'll be back next week.
We'll be back next week. Drink more water like Dr. Zach Rogers is doing. We appreciate you tuning in. We'll be back next week.